Okay, so our next speaker this morning is Mr. John Clancy and Mr. Mark Bender. They will be discussing the topic of supercharging your tribe's clean energy projects with the help of the Inflation Reduction Act. Mr. Clancy is shareholder and the leader of Godfrey and Kahn's Energy Strategies Practice Group and its Indian Nations Group. Mark Bender is special counsel and member of Godfrey and Kahn's SC Energy and Indian Law teams. So without further ado, here is Mr. Clancy.
Cool. Thank you very much. As noted, I'm John Clancy. I head up Godfrey and Kahn, which are the law firms in Wisconsin's energy practice and Indian law practice, and we've been working with tribes for about the last 20 years on environmental and energy and other issues. I had the good fortune to do that, and what we're going to talk about today is really what Dr. Tommy Jones kind of led into. There's just a lot of funding available now with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We want to focus on what's available under that, a little bit also what's available under the Infrastructure Act for charging infrastructure as well, and just kind of giving you a good idea, hopefully, of what's available now, what you should be watching for to try to take advantage of as the months go on, because the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in August, late August of last year. So it's still being implemented. There's still a lot of guidance coming out, both from the agencies like DOE, BIA, et cetera, as well as Treasury on the tax credits. And both are basically supercharged. There's improvements to existing grants, there's new grants, and then there's dramatic improvements on the tax credits that we'll talk about, and the ability to use them, and ability for tribes to directly use them, that allow you to kind of match together funds and should allow, I think, in general, for most projects to be fully paid for. So that's the good news. And there's a lot of money, so it means a lot of projects can be paid for. And then one thing I wanted to highlight too before we really get going is it is really important to be aware of DOE's programs. Right now is their grant out there presently. So if you haven't started on it now, it's probably too late because it's due, I think the 9th, so really soon. As well as there's one for electrification of areas that were not electrified before, and that's due on the 23rd of February. But the big news is that there's another round that's even bigger coming up this spring or summer. And they're great grants, mostly because DOE is great to work with, first of all, but then secondly, because they've now dramatically increased the funding available. They've also increased, therefore, the per project funding available, and they dramatically decreased the cost share. And with the tax credits and stuff like that that are available to be directly received, all those projects, or at least all the projects that are energy generation related or have battery storage, should be able to be fully funded with the combination of the tax credits plus their funding. But what I want to focus on now, and Mark will focus on, is really what you can get out of the Inflation Reduction Act. In addition to that, and you should be thinking about, as we go through things, and think, how do you pair this stuff together? There's so many opportunities available now. How do you take advantage of what everything is out there, and then how do you pair the stuff together to make sure all your projects are fully funded? So with that, let's see, this actually works here. I'm sure it will, but can you hold on a second? I'm just going to move this around here so I can see it too. Oops. And we'll just get started. So what we're going to talk about are really two topics on grants. One, there's existing grants out there that were enhanced dramatically by the Inflation Reduction Act, and then there's new grant programs that are available, and a lot of them are directly focused on tribes. There's tribal set-asides that are very, very significant, so it's very good to know about that as well. And then once we get through the grants, Mark's going to talk about the tax credits. So the tax credits have both been kind of saved because they were kind of going away. They've been increased in amount. There's also the ability to get bonus credits, especially bonus credits for projects that are on Indian lands or serve low-income homes and people. So it really allows for the potential for significant additional credits, higher credits for tribal projects, either because they're on tribal lands and or because they also serve lower-income tribal members, like housing projects. And then there's other bonus credits as well. And then there's the ability to get the credits directly, or if you have a tribal entity that doesn't get the credits directly, to sell the credits rather than have a partner in the project. So it simplifies the process to use the tax credits. And then we'll go into a little bit about HUD has training opportunities similar to DWE's, but a little bit different. I'll talk about how those work and how they can help you kind of shape projects. And then we'll talk about also the funding available for charging and for electric vehicles and stuff like that as well under both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act. So it'll be a little bit of a whirlwind of what's available, but hopefully it's clear. Feel free to raise any questions either along the way or at the end. I just want to make sure you guys are as knowledgeable as you can be about what's available. So the first discussion is, what's added to, and the big grant program that's been added to, it's still, frankly, not quite as good as the DOE program. So I think you should be all focused on the DOE program as well. But this can be very valuable, especially if you combine it with tax credits, and especially if you're really trying to, push the envelope a little bit and get as many projects in as you can that make economic sense, that can be either fully funded or make economic sense. This program is the USDA REAP program, which is the Rural Energy for America program. And historically, it's been a program where you can either use it for energy efficiency or renewable energy projects, and they also have competitive loan guarantees. I'm not going to focus so much on the loan side of things, frankly, because there's so much money that's available directly, either through grants or tax credits, that we should be trying, I think, to fund as much of our projects as we can without loans. If you do some major project, like you're doing a large solar installation to sell to the grid and not really use as much on reservation to also, let's say, a 50 megawatt projects or so, then you really need to think about the loans. But if you're thinking more about funding stuff for your tribe itself, I think you should be thinking about the fact that we should be able to fund these things either wholly or very close to wholly from these grants and tax credits that we're talking about. So the REAP program has been around for a long time. It's very good. It has funding. It had historically funding up to $500,000 for, let's say, a solar project or other renewable energy project. It also had up to $250,000 for energy efficiency. Because of the, and actually this slide, they asked for the slides before, I think for the holidays, and so a lot has been happening. So since that time, the Inflation Reduction Act has now been implemented by USDA for this, and so they've now doubled the grant amounts. It's up to $1 million for like a solar project or other renewable energy project, and it's up to $500,000 for an energy efficiency project. So the program got better that way because of the significant funding. The significant funding is that they added $2 billion to this funding. So there's a lot more money available under the program than in the past. Some of the money is reserved for what they call underused technologies, so things besides solar, but most of it's available generally. The good news about this program is that it's a really relatively simple application. So it's good to think about, again, if you, let's say you're going for the DOE grant, you're not sure you're going to get it, or you get it and you have more projects to do. So it's good to be aware of it for that reason. They also increased the grant amount allowed under the statute up to 50% from 25%, but actually USDA, I think because there's so much demand for the program and there's so much funds being available, they reduced it down to 40%, so it's 40% funding. The thing to think about, though, there is that if you can get the tax credit, and especially the bonus tax credits that comply, you may be able to fully fund the project with the combination of this grant and the tax credits we'll talk about later on. So for REAP, it's not directly accessible by tribes. It doesn't have tribe in the list of eligible entities, but it includes any agricultural operation, basically, as well as small businesses. And the tribe can set up a small business either as a Section 17 corporation or another entity and get the grant anyway. So there's a step involved of setting up an entity that might be the energy entity. One thing to think about is if you're trying to establish some sort of tribal utility operation, that might be the entity to set up and have it get this grant then. It also has to be in a rural area. So in a rural area it's basically everything that's not a city that's 50,000 people or the surrounding urbanized area. So most reservations, fortunately, are also in the rural category, at least portions of them, so you can take advantage of this for that. And then if you're going for, a grant that's over $200,000 or a project that's over $200,000, so most projects are going to be that size now unless you're just doing a pilot project. For that, you need a feasibility study. But the good news is that, like for solar, all you need is to work with a solar installer. They can run a helioscope, what's called a helioscope or PV watts report, and that basically does it for you on that. So it's a really it's a simpler application because of that. So that's another piece of good news. And then if you're doing an energy efficiency project, that requires some kind of energy audit. They need to show that the energy efficiency project will actually do something that will be successful. So you'll need an audit in that case. But especially for the renewable energy side of things, it's one of the easier grants to go after, which is great. It also can help fill in if your DOE has certain limitations on its grants. You can't use it to just sell energy to the grid. This one could be. So there's becoming more and more of these are called parallel generation programs now from utilities, where they'll pay you pretty well to just sell the energy to the grid. It kind of allows you to, in a backdoor way, create something that feels like community solar. That's an interesting issue as to how DOE will think about that. So it's probably important to be aware of that as well for this grant as perhaps a backup plan for that. So now I'm going to get into things that are new, that were never around, that the Inflation Reduction Act created. And there's a bunch of stuff. The first thing I'll talk about are the high efficiency home rebate program, and then a parallel program for a whole house efficiency program. They're kind of grouped together. They both come out through DOE, not the Indian Energy Division, but DOE generally. But they have a set aside too for tribes. So tribes can go after the money directly and get the money and then disperse it, or basically run the rebate program to get the money back to tribal members and to the Tribal Housing Authority if it's the one that's doing the improvements. And what they do is they allow for 50% rebates if you're up to 150% income level for folks that are in that category. And then the good news is that for basically all HUD tribal housing type stuff, that will be considered low income and you'll get 100% of the money back. So up to $14,000 per household. So and this is an electrification grant. So this is if you're taking homes, especially some of your older homes that might be inefficient, might be heated by propane or oil or wood, things that are not as efficient and are more polluting. It allows you to replace the units in those homes with air source heat pumps, cleaner electrical systems to allow the homes to switch over all to electricity. What that really allows you to then do is to incorporate things like solar, especially if the utility has a decent net metering program, to create net zero homes. Because you can add in solar through the other grants I'll talk about, and you'd have, you take your home, you put in high efficiency electrical stuff, make it run on electricity, and then get a grant for solar from DOE or these other grants I'll talk about later on, and you could make your homes net zero so that there's no energy cost basically to the home except for the hookup charges. And as I noted before, there's a big set aside, $225 million for tribes. So tribes get to run this part of the program. The key thing on this, though, is that there's going to be an application process for this. And the other key thing is that right now, DOE is taking comments on that. So if you have a strong interest in this and you want to start thinking about how this applies to my tribe, how do we make sure our tribe is well situated to get the money, you might want to look online. There's a DOE opportunity for comments on this, I think up until March 3rd. So, and a related program then is what they call the whole energy performance-based or whole house rebates or the home rebates. This is really to provide funding for improvements to, let's say, less efficient homes, either to go to 20% more efficient and get up to $4,000 or, up to $2,000 per home, or go 35% efficient and get to $4,000 per home. So this is another way of doing it. If you're not going all electric, you can still get funding for more efficient homes. But the big thing, I think, is just be tracking this, because there's a lot of money that's going to flow through tribes for this, and it's a way of, this is not so much right now the putting solar on the home, it's addressing the efficiency side of the home. They want to make the homes as efficient as possible, so they want to get up money so you can do that. And the big thing is that tribes can apply for it directly, get control of the funding, and then distribute it on the reservation here, as opposed to having to go through the state. And again, I think in total there's about $300 million that's reserved for tribes for these programs. And one last thing, again, if you have a real strong interest in this program, if you want to talk afterwards, that'd be great. But if you want to also reach out and provide any comments to DOE, the comment period is now open for this. And this just goes through the follow-up. This slide, again, this package was submitted before the holidays, so it talked about, the DOE outreach. That's already occurred, and now they're asking for comments back. So again, I think it's important for every tribe to be aware of this, because you'll want to make sure your tribe can get your chunk of money and then can distribute these rebates to folks. And then basically in spring is when they'll probably have the program to release the rebates, or to over control the rebates to states and tribes, and then in the summer or later on this program becomes generally available. So that's one program. That's really a lot of money available to tribes to help their members and their housing authorities get their homes more efficient, either through switching over to electricity total, with what oftentimes they call beneficial electrification, where you're putting in stuff that's highly efficient and electrical, in large part because it's easier to then use renewable energy as like through solar and things like that to make the energy clean. And then also for like this a whole home efficiency improvement if you're not going all electric. The next thing that came up, or the next thing that in the Inflation Reduction Act that's big, that's important to know about, is the Tribal Electrification Program. And really this is a program to provide funds to either take unelectrified homes or buildings and make them electrified. So especially in areas like Alaska or more remote areas where there's not electricity delivered to the buildings directly, to get those electrified. Or two, for electrified buildings to make them use clean energy, like use solar, use other technologies that are clean. And the good news about this program is that there's zero cost share on it at all. So it's all, if you have a project to be funded, it'll be fully funded by DOE. The money's available till 2031, so it's like almost a 10-year program that'll be going on. It's administered by the BIA. So the BIA will be working on getting, I checked out their website this morning again, they're still working on developing the program, so it's not out that far along yet, but it's another important one to track because of the fact it's a lot of money. It'll be coming solely to any country to electrify buildings and to put the solar and other clean energy on buildings. And there's going to be a competitive process for this. So this is all, what this I'm talking about now is what's in the statute, is what's the basic parameters will be required. The details will come out as BIA develops the program. But it's supposed to be based on 3 criteria. So there's kind of 3 categories to get the money. One is for if you have a pilot project that's ready to implement. So a project might be doing one or a few buildings, but on a pilot basis, it's ready to go. So that'll be one category. Another one will be community scale projects, which is for the folks who have done DOE grants. I assume it'll be somewhat like theirs, where it's a project that's meant to serve a good portion of the reservation. So a number of buildings, a lot, like a lot of homes, or a number, like perhaps all the tribal administration buildings, stuff like that. And then there's also ones that are really focused on tribes with less capacity and less resources, higher poverty rates. So they're going to have those 3 categories, and within that, that they're going to do is they're going to have at least 15% of the funds go to each category, and they'll have you decide, which category you're applying for, and then you make your application. The big thing to do is try to track this as it goes along, and how BI is developing the programs. So you can kind of think about your projects ahead of time, how they'll work for you under these programs, and probably think about those 3 categories. Are we going to have pilot projects? Are we going to have community-wide type projects, community-scale projects, or can we also fall within the kind of lack of capacity and poverty situation where we need more assistance on stuff? And they're going to look at it in terms of both the need for the project and the readiness. So another thing is this, I think this is kind of like the Stimulus Act was before, making projects shovel ready. Get them going in your mind, get them going in planning so you're ready to go. When the funding hits, you're ready to go get it. So then there's a third category of tribal-only money that's in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is more for resilience. This is climate resilience. So it's not putting energy projects in, it's building up the resiliency of the reservation. So there's $220 million here. Again, it's through BIA. It's available for funding. It's again available through basically 2031. So it'll be money that'll be added to and supplement other programs that relate to resiliency under the Infrastructure Act, and just normal funding, and make more money available for tribes in these areas. And this slide here just kind of walks through the different areas that they're looking at doing, or that they're focused on. It includes habitat restoration and adaptation. So if you're working if you have tribal forests, for example, and you're working to enhance those, you'd want to think about this. Or if you have If there's natural areas in the reservation that you want to restore, you'd want to think about this. There's also community-directed relocation projects. So I think we worked, for instance, with the tribes out on the coast of Washington State, where there's a tsunami potential, and they're working to relocate various portions of their villages or their reservations up into higher ground. So that'd be good for this. But there could be other tribes that have other needs to, let's say, build a new administration building because the old one is in an area that would be in problems if there's cases of storms, things like that. So I think it's also just probably generally building up resiliency on the reservation that way. And then there's just going to be other programs as well, including fish hatcheries. But if you're looking to build up infrastructure, to build various buildings on the reservation, I think it's also just important to track this because there's a lot of money coming through this now too. This is in addition to what will come through annual appropriations, things like that. I think that also because it seems like this funding has been building on itself for a little while. Like DOE's funding has grown and grown and grown. As the Congress has been thinking about this more, they're realizing how much money is needed in these areas. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's higher allocations in the annual allocations to the budget as well. So it's important to track this stuff because there's probably going to be a lot more funding available in this area too. So, so those are three key areas that were not available before for funding that are now. You know, electrification, energy efficiency through the whole home, and then also the money for resiliency. But now also there's money that'll be available, and this is probably more important for your tribal members that have homes that they own, and they might be above the income levels normal. So this would normally apply because if they're if they're in your tribal housing, the tribal housing authority will be the one that's really going to be going after the funds and bringing them in, and will be focused on getting the funding that's especially available for lower income situations. But there is also basically a home property credit that's been dramatically expanded, or dramatic may be too strong, but significantly expanded for energy efficiency improvements that are put in the home. And they basically have, there used to be a very small lifetime limit on it. So if you guys have done this at all of your homes, like you get your doors done, you could do it, but you get one credit and that's it, and that's for your lifetime. Now it's up to $1,200 per year, with the exception one category doesn't have that limit either. But so you could make improvements to a home every year and get basically 30% tax credits back as a homeowner. So I think it's, especially for folks, if you're in a tribe that might have a little bit more wealth among the members, or members live in their own homes, that kind of situation, it's good to know about this program as well. And probably, the role of the folks in this room is probably just to educate the members to make sure they're aware of this, so they can take advantage of it. So you'll see there's various amounts available for various types of things you do. I think the biggest thing to be aware of is that the $2,000 amount for air source heat pumps, basically for heat pump technology, is not subject to the $1,200 limit. So you could have that plus other stuff going on. So you can really work with them to make the same kind of improvements that you might be making in your tribal housing basically. Work with them. They could even work with the same contractors to do it, to take advantage of this for their own homes. And then, so then on top of that is, out of the Inflation Reduction Act comes funding available for the same kind of folks that own their homes that might put solar on them, your members that might put solar in their own homes. It's probably important to make them aware that there's also a significant tax credit available to them now. What it really does is it expands out the tax credit. It was at one point 30%, and then it was working its way down to 22%, and was going down to 10% and go away. Now it's back up to 30% and will stick there for a long time. So it provides an opportunity, especially if you're doing, let's say solar for your tribal housing authority folks. You might want to make your members that are in their own homes aware of this too, for them to do their own projects as well. It's noted here, it no longer applies to biomass furnaces, but that's already covered then under the, the energy efficiency stuff I've already talked about. So that's just been moved in a category over. And then it also, though, applies to battery storage now too. So you could have, if you have members that have, battery storage is important to think about, I think, in two situations especially. One is where your utility doesn't have a good net metering program. So if the utility doesn't provide retail credit for, let's say, solar energy produced, and you're only getting a little bit for the extra energy that goes out to the grid, then you want to think about, should we do battery storage because we get the energy here, and in large part because also a lot of these grants I've been talking about cover either 80% or 100% or whatever of the cost, and then you have the tax credits to mix in there too. So you can cover the cost of that too now through these programs. And then the second situation is obviously if you have resiliency problems. If you have, I know Seminole is working through that where they had big storms coming through this area and rural areas, stuff like that, and have to deal with those issues. So the fact that battery storage is now included in this tax credit as well as the tax credits that Mark's going to talk about is really very important, especially for tribes that are in that kind of situation. So now, in addition to all that, now I'm going to talk about a bunch of programs that are available that are not necessarily tribal specific, but tribes can apply for them, and there's a lot of money here available. I'll just, rather than read them here, I'm just going to go right into them so we have enough time, and because there's a lot to talk about for them. So the first one is called the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, and this is, implemented through EPA. It's part of the Clean Air Act now. And it's $5 billion, so a lot of money available to communities to basically go green. So, and especially, let's say your tribe is interested in saying, or thinking that these DWE grants are great, and the stuff you talked about before, John, is great too, but we really want to make the whole reservation green. We want to, especially green up the energy on the whole reservation. We want to put in enough solar and other technologies, battery storage or whatever, wind, whatever is appropriate technology, so we can, and also put in place energy efficiency improvements on all our buildings so we can, go as close as possible to net zero on carbon, also to reduce as much as possible the energy bills on the reservation. This provides a great opportunity to do that. So there's going to be a funding announcement for this in May. At least that's what's required by the law. Sometimes things get pushed back a little bit, as you're probably aware, but that's when you should be watching for this. Right now, EPA is actually still gathering information about this, so if you have particular things you want to raise to them about this program, now is the time for reach out about this, I think, to try to help shape the program. But it's again, $5 billion, of which $250 million is available for planning grants. So if you are interested in this and you want to kind of plan out how do we take the reservation green as a whole, it makes sense to think about applying for this $250 million pot of money, or your share of it, to plan out green projects. And then on top of that, especially if you get that one of those grants, then you're well positioned to get up to your share of up to $4.75 billion in implementation grants. So money to implement the projects. They don't say in here what the cost share is going to be or what it'll be, but they'll probably be thinking about how do we make these things cost zero or close to zero, especially when you think about the tax credits getting brought in the project too. So they might say you need to be, might be 50% funding or 60% funding or 70% funding, depending on how they think the tax credits will play out for these kinds of projects. And it really, you can also do this to develop programs and policies as well as projects. But I think they're really looking at is, if you do this, how certain it is that there'll be significant carbon reductions and that they'll be permanent. They'll really occur and really be permanent. So, and then states, municipalities, and importantly tribes can apply for this. And then this is a scoring criteria from the statute. There'll probably be more details on this, but this is what comes out of the statute. It's the degree to which greenhouse gas air pollution is projected to be reduced, including with respect to low-income and disadvantaged communities. So that's where I think, especially if you're thinking about adding this to your tribal housing, let's say, which has lower-income members in it, let's say, and then also, tribes are, I think, by definition now a disadvantaged community, so you'll be well situated to put it in an application in this area. And then it's also, they want to know that it's quantifiable, specific, additional, and permanent and verifiable reductions. So they want to see that you're going to do things that really should have reductions that will occur and that would not otherwise occur. So you want to be able to explain how this project will dramatically lower carbon and other emissions and how it would not occur without this funding. Again, that's not out yet, but it'll be coming out relatively shortly, so it's important to track that as well. Then there's another big set of grants that's available under this. This is the Environmental and Climate Justice Grants. So this is $2.8 billion of funding. Again, a lot of funding available. This has to actually be, if a tribe's going to do it, it has to do it either through a community-based organization or in partnership with a community-based organization. So you might work with, it could be really whatever. If there's let's say a Boys and Girls Club on the reservation, or there's an organization that works on issues on the reservation, they need to be a partner in the application at least. But that's something to think about. So thinking about who we'd partner with, or if the application would just go through them. But it's really meant, again, to affect disadvantaged communities. And fortunately, I think the Biden executive orders and stuff that have come out have recognized the importance of considering tribes as folks to fund in these kinds of areas. And then what's it available to use? It's more broad than the carbon reduction grant I talked about before. It does include things that second bullet point, low and zero emission and resilient technology. So that would be like something like solar and solar plus storage or wind plus storage or other technologies like that. But it's also money for resiliency type stuff, so if you're especially going to put money, let's say, in a community center that might be available to folks during storms that would occur during climate change type events, and it's a resilient building or resilient infrastructure to be used for that. It could also be used to address indoor air toxics. It can also for community engagement and for like pollution monitoring and stuff like that too. So it's a broader grouping of things. It'll be interesting to see what EPA kind of directs you towards in this area when the grant opportunity comes out. But it's another way. In fact, you might want to be thinking, we want to go, much greener. We want to have more access to federal funds. So we want to do all that stuff, and we'll think about both these programs because both would probably be great for those kinds of things. And if you want to incorporate more resiliency into your stuff, that's where the environmental and climate justice block grant can be really helpful. So then on top of that, so there's all these different layers of funding coming through. On top of that is a huge $27 billion fund that's going to be set up. It's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and it's basically money made available primarily to basically nonprofit financial organizations to get money out to these projects to help, I think, fill in the gaps on these projects. So in addition to all the grants we've been talking about and the tax credits that Mark will be talking about, if there's any gaps in your project, this will be very helpful to help fund them. That's another reason why I prefer with tribes not to focus on loans now, but focus on these opportunities to just fund fully these projects. There's going to be 3 categories of this. One is for zero emission technologies. So the first one is really if you're putting in things like solar, things that are wind, things that have absolutely no emissions, that would be good for this. And the other 2 are really greenhouse gas and air pollution reduction projects, but they might include technologies that still emit somewhat or reduce, but not fully, the emissions associated with the project. And there's money available under the second 2 categories. The first of the second 2 is generally to anybody. The second one is really focused on low-income and disadvantaged communities. So tribes actually should be able to take advantage of all 3 of these programs. Again, they're not out yet. This is probably the most undefined area because there's going to be a lot of elements that have to be put into how these funds will work and what the funds actually do with the money, whether it's, low interest or forgivable loans, or whether it's just more grants, things like that. But we should be tracking this because it's an important way to help fill in any remaining gaps. And there's just so much money here available that I think there'll be many ways to use it to make sure your projects all get completed. So on the zero emission projects, that's $7 billion of the funding. And this actually is an area where tribes can directly apply as an eligible entity to get those funds and then to pass them down. So if your tribe wants more control of these issues, you probably want to be tracking this program as well. It's kind of like a bigger version or more general version of what we talked about before with tribes being able to get the money for the rebate stuff. If you want to be able to have more say in how the program's defined, your tribe does, and wants to make sure it's best serving your members and your tribal buildings and your tribal operations, it's probably a great one to go after, especially if you're thinking about we're going to put in a lot more solar or other, zero emission technology. And it's really to enable low-income and disadvantaged communities. So I think in both areas, tribes have typically points to make. Either we're going to put stuff in to help our tribal housing out, if it's low-income housing, and just in general for the disadvantaged community idea. So, and it's looking at, they actually particularly point out rooftop solar. So I think they're looking at that kind of stuff. More technologies that are probably clean and simple to implement that are zero emission. And then the other 2 categories, there's $12 billion for basically activities that reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. So they could still avoid it totally. They could be ones that, like solar that avoid it, but they could be technologies that more so reduce the carbon rather than totally take it away. And this funding, as well as the next one, this $8 billion additional money that's available for the same kind of things, but targeted at low-income and disadvantaged communities, which many tribes may be in a good situation to apply for or to get the funding to flow through to them. These are both going to be money that doesn't flow directly to the tribe, but would flow to an eligible nonprofit financing entity that would then get the money to situations like with tribes, for tribes and others. So both are very important things to be aware of, and especially as you start to, again, I think the big thing is thinking of ways to fully fund. I think the time now is to think big on projects and to think that we can probably fully fund them, and how do we do that, with all these different programs. So one more area to talk about briefly, maybe I guess two more areas before we get to Mark, and the tax credits are the following. One is the $1 billion available for what they call rural electric loans. This is for rural areas, obviously, and it's focused on electric generation, but it can include storage. So it could be solar plus storage. So if you have a project like that from renewable energy resource, it's for resale to residents. It's not quite clear what they mean by residents, whether it can only be homes or also other buildings. So we'll be tracking that, where that goes. But the big news is that it's a loan. This is really inclusive. It's a loan, so we typically don't want loans, but this is such a good loan. It's good to talk about because it's really a loan grant. So it's forgivable to 50%, up to 50%. So it could go down. It could be let's say you get $1 million. It could be that the first $500,000 is forgivable, and the remaining amount is at the average tax-exempt municipal bond rate, which is basically the lowest rate of a loan you can get. So this may be really valuable if you could go after this, for example, for some of your projects. Also get the tax credits on it, which might be 30, 40, 50%, 60%, or 70%, depending on how many bonus credits you can get. And you could fully fund the project from this plus your tax credits alone. So it's another thing at least be aware of, and important to track as you, again, try to fund all your projects. The last thing I'll talk about here is this really probably relates more to the commercial buildings on the reservation for casinos, hotels, other business operations. Perhaps if you have a large administration type building. This is more if you're going to make them energy efficient, whether they're new or you're fixing up an older building. They've really supercharged this, what they call the 179D deduction, and they made it eligible for tribes now for the first time. So they supercharged it by dramatically increasing the amount it can be on any one project, from $1.80 per square foot up to $5 per square foot. It's weird. It's a tax deduction. It's immediately available, so you get this tax deduction right away. Tribes can't use that, but now for the first time, tribes can sell that to the folks that do the energy efficiency improvements on their buildings. So it's another thing to think about if you're looking at either building new buildings that are really efficient, or building or enhancing your existing buildings with energy efficiency projects. It's important to be aware of this and make sure when you're negotiating your deal, you can get this reduction in costs from that too. So that's a lot of stuff, obviously, that's available out there. But the good news is that there's a ton of stuff out there, and it'll become more and more it will become more knowledgeable what's going on as they implement these programs. And the great news is that you can, again, think as big as you want on your energy projects and think that we should have a strategy to fund all of them now.
Thank you. So now we're going to go over a couple of the tax credits that are involved in the IRA, because what's better than two lawyers talking about tax credits first thing in the morning. So I'm going to go over these kind of at a high level. Just remember, if you have questions or anything you want to talk about, feel free to reach out to both of us afterward too. Some of this gets a little complicated. I think the important thing to remember too right away is that a lot of these tax credits are cumulative and all stack on top of each other. So we're talking about 30% plus 10% plus 10%. So kind of be thinking about that as I go through some of these. So to start off, we're going to talk about the ITC, which is the investment tax credit. And this deals with investments in physical infrastructure. It's usually paired with the production tax credit, which addresses how much energy is produced over time. This is how much investment goes into that physical infrastructure. The ITC did exist before, but it was kind of phasing down year over year. And what the IRA did was extend it out to give certainty for about 10 years and then change the percentage of the tax credits, change that structure. So right now there's a base credit rate of 6%, but a bonus credit rate up to 30%. These bonus credits, a couple of the requirements you have to meet to get that 30% bonus credit is the project has to either be less than 1 megawatt AC, which includes if there's more than one energy property as part of a single project. A second is construction has to begin before 60 days after guidance on prevailing wage and apprenticeship comes out. That deadline was January 28th, so that's already passed. So if construction is going to begin now or in the future, this criteria won't really apply. The third one is just meeting those prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So as far as apprenticeship, there's different levels depending on what year we're talking about. If construction begins before January 1st of 2023, there has to be 10% apprenticeship and certain journeyman to apprenticeship ratios. And this next one should say in 2023, the project begins in 2023, that percentage goes up to 12.5%. And if it begins after December 31st of 2023, that percentage goes up to 15%. And the rates are subject to any applicable ratios from Department of Labor or each state's separate apprenticeship requirements. As far as prevailing wage, is a set wage depending on the scope of work and the type of work set by Department of Labor. And these apply to not only construction of the project to begin with, but also alteration and repair on the project for the first 5 years of operation. And again, prevailing wage requirements really deal with laborers and mechanics who are paid wages not less than the prevailing wage for construction, alteration, or repair. I think the shorthand usually is thinking about union labor is kind of what this translates to. So for the first time, the ATC is also extended to cover both storage and microgrid controls on a project. The energy storage has to be at least 5 kilowatt hours for that size of the storage project. And the microgrid controllers, which are controlling the energy resources and have to be capable of operating in connection with the grid as a single controllable entity in connection with the grid and independent from the grid. And that's kind of how they define the microgrid. That basis for that, again, that the 6 or the 30% tax credit also now includes interconnection equipment, which is money paid or taken on by installing that interconnection property for the project. Now these projects will have a maximum output of no more than 5 megawatts. So kind of keep that in mind. I mean, that's a pretty big project, but keep that in mind as you're thinking about all these tax credits. So now we'll start getting into all the adders. The first one we'll go over is the increased credit for domestic content. So for any project, there can be up to a 10% adder if the prevailing wage or apprenticeship requirements are met for using domestic content in the project. And domestic content is defined as any steel, iron, or manufactured product which is a component of the facility and produced in the United States. There are some specific requirements for steel and iron, and that those processes have to take place in the United States, but doesn't apply to certain manufactured products or rolling stock. That percentage requirement for the manufactured products is that not less than 40% of the total cost across all the manufactured products, including the components and subcomponents, have to be mined, produced, or manufactured in the United States. And I think this is one where we're still waiting for guidance from Treasury on what exactly those components and subcomponents are going to be defined as. Another adder is the increased credit rate for placing a project in an energy community. This can again be up to an additional 10 percentage points on that credit, on that bonus credit, if the project is placed in an energy community. An energy community is defined as a brownfield site or a census tract with oil, coal, natural gas, mining, processing facilities in it, or a census tract that had a coal mine closed before essentially 2000, or a coal-fired power plant closed after 2009. So we're thinking about those on where the projects can be placed. You know, if you have a plant with the coal-fired unit, or even if it's a manufacturing facility that closed a coal facility down, thinking about putting the project on those properties can get into this additional 10% adder. There's also an additional portion of the law, which is the, if I remember, the Environmental Justice Capacity Limitation Allocation. So it's a great name and easy to remember. But this is an incentive for wind and solar facilities less than 5 megawatts, which also include energy storage property. And there's an allocation that the Secretary will make within 180 days. We're expecting that allocation and some of the details to be coming out really any day now. And how it works is that there's 1.8 gigawatts or 1,800 megawatts set aside for these projects in 2023 and in 2024. If anything isn't used up in 2023, it can carry over into 2024. But after 2024, this allocation won't be around anymore. With the limitation allocation, there's also an increased 10% adder if the project is located in a low-income community or on Indian land, and a 20% credit if the project is in one of the low-income qualifying locations that John had talked about earlier. So now with all these tax credits and adders and all this math, how do you take advantage of it? How do you actually get this money into the project? So before the Inflation Reduction Act, tribes and TDHEs which don't pay income tax needed a taxable partner to take advantage of these programs. And how this would work out is the tax partner would own 99 or 100% of the project company, the LLC, and then the investor would get those credits and the depreciation deductions. We probably should maybe move this slide up next time, but just to go over some of these principles. So a tax credit is that dollar for dollar reduction in tax liability. You know, if you have a $1,000 tax credit and you owe $1,000 in taxes, that takes the liability down to zero. Depreciation, on the other hand, is the right to deduct capital costs over time from taxable income. So if you had, pick a number, $500 in depreciation off $1,000 of income, then you're just getting taxed on that last $500. So that's how depreciation and tax credits interplay. And then a limited liability company is just a partnership-like structure that allows for allocation of ownership interests among those tax investors and those tax partners. So again, before the IRA, before the Inflation Reduction Act, tribes or any entity that didn't pay income tax had to find a partner to invest in to take advantage of all those tax credits. The investor would claim all the tax credits, and then that LLC, that project company, would sell energy to the tribe, to the other entity at a lower cost that reflected how they could share those tax benefits. So you can see it's a pretty complicated relationship, a lot of moving parts. And the key change in the IRA, and we talk to clients and folks about this all the time, is this ability now to get direct pay, to get the tax credit for tribes, for nonprofit entities. And these tax-exempt entities are now treated as they've made a payment of tax equal to the value of the credit. So there's kind of this legal fiction where we're pretending that somebody paid the $1,000 in taxes, and so you can apply and get that tax credit back as if you did pay that tax. This doesn't apply, this direct pay doesn't apply, unfortunately, to the depreciation deductions as well. So thinking about all of that and thinking about which option is best, you kind of have to keep all this in mind. You know, what is your tribe's, what is your entity's ability to use a tax credit in non-federal cost share for some of the grants that John talked about, or other grants that may be in your state with different state agencies. Whether you need money in addition to the tax credit and the potential grants, and how do you maximize all those resources. The value of those depreciation deductions versus the return required by an investor, if you're going to go that route, or the involvement of an investor in the complexity that it can take on. The Inflation Reduction Act now finally also allows for the transfer of tax credits. So entities who couldn't take the tax credits are now allowed to transfer them to another entity. So this could be a sale it has to be for cash, and it has to be less than the tax credit's value. But there's no income from that sale, and there's no expense from the purchase. So now we'll turn it back over to John to go over a few planning items.
Great, thanks. And maybe just a few things to kind of point out about This is working now. Yeah, there we go. About the tax credits, just to kind of highlight what Mark was talking about. Mark talked a little about the fact that you might have to meet prevailing wages and apprenticeships if you're doing a bigger project above a megawatt. That mostly gets into planning. Most travel projects, as Tommy noted, the first speaker, tend to be below megawatt that are going forward, and most can be broken up to be below megawatt. But you got to make sure your projects aren't grouped together to be more than a megawatt AC. So I think with decent planning or good planning ahead, you can be able to break up your projects based on how you contract for them, when they occur, where they occur, so they aren't aggregated to be more than a megawatt, and then you don't need to worry about that issue. So I think we're working on projects right now where we're thinking through how do we aggregate them or not to address that issue. So just so that's clear. So the big thing is you should be able to plan your projects to get to 30% at least. And then the bonus credits can take you on substantially beyond that. So if the domestic content, the biggest issue there is that solar is not, solar panels are typically almost all produced abroad right now. There's actually comments in whether there should be a waiver for a while on domestic content for panels, batteries, inverters, stuff like that. That's really hard to get in America. So we'll see where that goes. But regardless, there's also in the IRA all these incentives to make stuff in America. So that will be happening over the next coming years too. So you want to track that a little bit too, to kind of think about the timing of your projects to get that 10% bonus credit, because that can help a lot too, especially if you have cost share beyond 30% on your projects. And then also, the key issue is be on top of this allocation for projects on Indian lands, which gets you a 10% bonus credit, or basically for like lower income housing, which would be for your tribal housing, which could get you instead 20% extra. So that could really bump up your credits from, if you get domestic content, plus you get one of those, it'd be 50 or 60% tax credits. And then if for any reason you have areas that are considered brownfields on the reservation, those are perfect sites to be thinking about solar and other technologies because of the 10% bonus credit there. So, and one last thing to think about too is that geothermal is also now included in the 30% tax credit or beyond, and geothermal systems are typically easier to get American made, so you could likely do a project like that might get up to 40% at least, and perhaps 50% if it's on an old brownfield site. So think about those kind of things. Think about planning your projects, and that's what we're getting into now, kind of planning your projects and thinking about, one key thing is obviously make sure it's always this balancing act. We do a lot of work in funding energy projects and other projects for tribes, and the big issue is how do you make sure you fund the project that you guys want, what your tribe needs, and then also match it up to the funding. The good news now is there's all these different categories of funding out there, so you should be able to have an easier job of matching up the two, because you always want to go back to what does our tribe really need, what does our housing authority really need, not what just is available through funding. But I think there's an ability now because of all these different options, to make that work much better. And then also think about all the funding sources that we've been talking about that can go into the project. Think also about, though, in many states, there's also local funding available through the utility or the state. So don't forget about that. We're from Wisconsin. The program that the state we're in is called Focus on Energy, but there's NYSERDA in New York. You guys are all around the country, so make sure you know that program too, those programs well. So you can, and especially on the energy efficiency side, even if there's not renewable energy stuff from those folks, there's almost always energy efficiency, especially for rehabbing stuff. So bring all that together to get all your project funded. And then think about the tax credits we've been talking about and how to take advantage of those and how to get these bonus tax credits if you can. And then obviously go after the stuff. But make sure your project makes sense in your mind first and what you're doing, and then you can really go after stuff. And that's why it's important to be thinking about this stuff before the deadlines, or before the announcements come out, because then you're under a deadline. So the more you can think about this stuff ahead really helps. And then think about if you have any partners. Does it make sense to have an installer partner to help you get information to put in your grant application? If you're using an investor, maybe make sure you understand who that might be ahead of time too. If you decide it makes more sense, especially on what Mark was talking about on the issue of do you go the old model and use an investor, or go the new model and take up the tax credits directly? One good thing is that DOE has made pretty clear that you can take the tax credits directly now and not have that be still non-federal cost share, which is great, but other agencies may not allow that. Also, we're working on a huge project for a tribe out west with a lot of microgrids, and so it made sense to stay with the investor, even though they could do it alone, because the investor is providing a lot of benefits. They're pre-funding everything into the project, basically. So it can make more sense still to have an investor involved if it's a bigger project and they help to fund everything, and if if you have like a buyout option that's early, so you can cut off their return and just buy the projects cheap at, let's say, year 6 or 7. So all those things kind of go into this stuff. One good thing, I think, there's two, we're lucky that there's the HUD Technical Assistance Program. There's also, the DWE Technical Assistance Program that Dr. Tommy talked about. And then also there's the HUD ONAP TA program. Folks that work in tribal housing authorities here probably are aware of that already. They have a great program where you can, it's just a 2-page application. You ask for assistance and they'll send basically experts in the area to talk through different issues, whether it's related to meeting the federal regulations requirements for complying with federal funding or other housing issues. But it also have created a new topic that's renewable energy and energy efficiency. So you can request on-reservation TA assistance for folks who come out and just go through your plans and all this stuff, and especially in light of all these funding sources, figure out what you might want to do. And it can be either virtual or on-site. Obviously, we're back on-site now a little more with the situation now. It was virtual for the last 2 years before this, basically. And then use that to develop your particular plans and strategies and have a plan of attack, which grants we're going to go after, what we're going to pursue. This is in your materials. If you click on the link, you'll get to the application. You can just say we want assistance with renewable energy and energy efficiency, and you'll be directed to folks. We're fortunate. We're one of the subcontractors that help in that area. I think it's been a great opportunity to really meet with tribes and focus on what is best for them, what's best for their housing, what's best for the tribe in general on these areas. And then what happens is you put it in, then it goes to the HUD ONAP office, and they contact like NAHC or First Pick, who's the provider, a higher level provider, than they bring in folks that are the technical experts to help with that stuff. So, I think this is a little repetitive, but, this is what might be in a strategy or plan that comes out of something like that, making sure there's clarity on what your goals are, what you're trying to pursue, and make sure it meets really your needs, which again is the first part to me, and then second part is how you get funding. But then work through various local and locational issues. Does solar even work over here, over there? And then thinking about the tax credits. We have a spot again it might qualify as a qualified brownfield to raise the tax credits. What do we do? And then think about it in light of, does our utility allow for community solar or not? Or do they have a parallel generation program that's like a community solar program where we could take advantage of that? Things like that. So we could do one big project versus little projects for each house, because it's much more efficient to do it as a big project, obviously. But you might also say, no, but we also have resiliency needs, so we need to put battery storage in every building. But think all that through together so you get a real plan of action that makes sense. And then think about what are the energy resources that are available. For most folks, it's been a lot of solar, but there could be other technologies that make a lot of sense. And then also thinking through what does your utility have? What's the rate structure there? What's the best way to offset that rate? And what's the programs they have? What kind of net metering, et cetera, do they have? And do they have incentives? And then really capture all these programs and then have a plan of action. And then, and I guess the biggest action point is you can think broad now. You can think, I want to go solar on all our homes. We want to have solar for all our buildings. We want to also make all our buildings hyper energy efficient. We want net zero for everything. You can actually kind of do that now very, very effectively. So I think, so Mark's going to finish up with the charging and electric vehicle stuff.
Yeah, thanks, John. We just want to touch on some of these EV infrastructure and EV incentives just to be aware of as you're thinking about transportation issues. These mostly come out of the infrastructure or the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed in 2021. There's a major $7.5 billion program related to EVs. One is about $5 billion for states to build infrastructure. The other piece was $2.5 million split between two programs for projects along these designated alternative fuel corridors, as well as grants for charging infrastructure in different communities that aren't necessarily on those corridors. So these again are focused on states, metro planning organizations, local governments, public authorities, tribes and territories are also eligible. So these designated alternative fuel corridors are aiming at getting EV charging, hydrogen, propane, natural gas fueling infrastructure installed. They include along those DAFCs, also have other locations for the community projects, which I'll go over in a little bit. But again, there's $2.5 billion in funding over 5 years for some of these programs, and the federal share can be up to 80% of that total project cost. Here's just the map. It's probably hard to see for folks in the back, but just to give you an idea of where these DAFCs are, they're kind of along the interstate system all throughout, I think, every state in the country. So these community grants can fund the 50%, so $1.25 billion of that funding is reserved for these community grants. The grant can be up to $15 million, which is probably aimed at more the institutional or larger organization funding, but up to that amount is available. And these are projects which reduce greenhouse gas emissions and expand or fill in gaps for publicly accessible charging or fueling infrastructure. And this can include both pre-construction activities like planning, feasibility analysis, as well as the actual acquisition and installation of the physical infrastructure. The locations for these community grant projects are on any public road or publicly accessible location, and priority is given to grant applications and proposals in rural areas, low and moderate income neighborhoods, and communities with a low ratio of private parking spaces to households or a high ratio of multi-unit dwellings to single-family homes. Some other priorities for the grants are geographic diversity, including the balance between urban and rural communities, and then meeting the current anticipated market demands for charging and fueling infrastructure, including increased charging speed, increased capacity for those chargers. So taking advantage of these grants, thinking about partnering with private entities. So any eligible entity can use the grant funds to partner with a private entity. And again, that can include buying, construction, installation, maintenance, operation of the infrastructure. And it allows to partner with charging companies, like ChargePoint or whoever big installation and charging management companies are, and providing land and 80% of development costs and negotiating for interest and rental payments for that land. Another tax credit in the infrastructure law is the alternative fueling and property credit. So this is extending the existing 30% credit for EV charging stations in eligible census tracts that are designated as either low income or non-urban. This is lowered to 6%, again, if it doesn't meet those wage and apprenticeship requirements, similar to what we talked about earlier. It's limited to $100,000 for charging station, and I believe it's actually the charging station. So you could have a number of stations in an installation that could all be eligible for this credit. And for the first time, this also includes bidirectional charging, which is when you hook up a car to an EV charger, car can take off energy or put back energy onto the grid. It's kind of a new technology. And again, this has the potential for tax-exempt entities to get that credit directly rather than having to go through an investment partner.
So actually, one thing to point out there, so that it may be possible as we watch this program develop that this could be used for the cost share on the 80% grants that you can get. So another way to think about fully fund the projects that may be available to you potentially.
So another credit is the actual vehicle credit, the clean vehicle credit. So this increases the availability of a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles. It decreases that limit. There used to be a limit of 200. The manufacturer had to make $200,000 or less. That's been eliminated now. The vehicle has to be assembled in North America. There's still some guidance I think we're waiting to see on some of those features as well. There is an income limitation on this tax credit, $300,000 for joint returns to $150,000 income for single and all other returns as well. There's also a limit on the price of the vehicle. So it can be $80,000 for vans, SUVs, and pickups, and $55,000 for other vehicles as well. And again, this act now allows the credit to be exchanged with the dealer so that you can get the credit actually from the dealer and work out an arrangement that way. Another credit is for used vehicles, and I've heard actually quite a few folks, friends in the transportation policy sector, talk about this as a real game changer where you can get a credit for a used EV now. This is a credit up to, or the lesser of $4,000 or 30% of the sale price. Again, income limitation on who can qualify for this credit, and the price of the used vehicle can't exceed $25,000. But this, I think, is really one to keep an eye on in the future, too, as more of these EVs are manufactured and there's more of a used car market. This could be a really valuable credit to take advantage of some of that. And then lastly is just noting the tax credit for commercial and fleet vehicles, for commercial and fleet EVs. This is a credit, again, lesser, the 30% of the cost of the vehicle, or not to exceed the difference between the EV and an internal combustion engine vehicle. There's a $7,500 for vehicles less than 14,000 pounds, $40,000 limit for anything over 40,000 pounds, 14,000 pounds, excuse me. And again, this is available to governmental bodies, tax-exempt organizations, and tribal governments who can receive this credit right through a direct pay election. So that's a lot. Are there questions or anything we can clarify? Yep.
For solar, you keep talking about PV, I'm sure. What about solar furnaces or solar heat?
Yeah, so solar can include like solar heating. It can also actually include, there's a new technology where they have I can't remember the name of it exactly, but there's windows that change based on how the sun hits them, that are electromagnetic or whatever. So when you're building your building, I think it's good to think about all these different options to incorporate features that might be green that way.
What kind of windows are those?
You know what they're called?
I can't remember the term off the top of my head. Electrochemical, electromagnetic.
Yeah, it's like we'll get that out, but it's basically if you they're the ones that will change coloration based on how the sun is, but they use an basically magnetic electrochromatic is what they're called. Sorry, our clients are starting to think about those, and we're thinking about those, for instance, on a ecology center that has an older building they're redoing, and they have to put very expensive windows in already. There's a lot of glass, so you might as well think about whether you could get that if you can get it cheaper if you did that way because of the big tax credit, especially if they're made in America. So the same things would apply. The made in America, if it's on a brownfield site or if it's for low income or in Indian lands, you could get bonuses as well. So it's great that way.
Hey, Mark, the alternative fuel corridor, right? With that, like, federal money is like allocated for that, right? So for the infrastructure too. So like, if you were to create a charging network between tribes, right? Could potentially the allocation of those federal funds, could that help like shore up roads? Because in some of our communities we've got bad roads, you know what I mean? And if you were to get that designation for that alternative fuel corridor, you could potentially like get that investment to those communities to help with the roads and the infrastructure in there, right?
I believe the alternative fueling corridors have already been designated. So I don't know that there's a designation you could get in the future on those.
Okay, so you can't, there's no designation.
Yeah, I think there's that map that's already out there. The states they've added some stuff to it. So there's like in northern Wisconsin, there's a fair amount of tribes. Obviously, there are corridors that kind of go through some of the tribal areas now, which is great. But in general, it's for more like freeway systems. You know, on the other hand, you could is a couple things to think about. One is for the community charging. You know, so there's funding for these designated alternative fuel corridors, which have to be along these corridors. But the community charging grant can be anywhere. This has to be on public accessible land. So if you have if your reservation is a little more remote, you could put charging on your reservation. It might be, if you have some kind of place where people don't really drive into, whether it's an administration building, a casino, hotel, C-store, whatever, you might put that charging there. You can also make money off the charging then, though, because you can charge rates for the charging too. So it could be a money maker that helps you pay for roads. It's almost like a tax from folks that come and use the system to get it that way.
Rather have the designated alternative fuel corridor if I could.
Yeah, well, but actually,
So I can allocate the federal funds to fix up my community.
yeah, although I think, I want to be clear though, the designated fuel, that designated alternative fuel corridor does not though get you money for the roads in general. It gets you for the charging, it gets you for the coming into the charging and out of the charging. What you might want to think about there is more, can we creatively use all this money coming through for climate resilience stuff? That $220 million for climate resiliency to take care of roads that are maybe beat up and are not ready for the weather, stuff like that. So you might want to think about infrastructure funding in general, which I think is going to be more and more prevalent to withstand storms, which might include your roads, your anything, you know, how you're trapping the storm water, stuff like that. So that may be funding to think about too there.
And then to you, John, the apprenticeship and wage requirements from the IT, from the
Tax credit?
Tax credits.
Yeah.
For the solar projects. You know, because I have to deal with Department of Labor and Industry, and I also have to deal with IBEW. You know what I mean? So they're always jumping on me because I'm non-union. You know what I mean? So like, are they gonna like start playing fair in the sandbox? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is changing the game for especially travel communities. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So.
Yeah. Now, I guess one thing to point out again is you want to be strategic about how you size your facilities and how you develop them so you can break them up so you're not subject to that necessarily. So that's a key issue, is to have more control over it that way. So if you're putting, let's say you want to say we want to put solar to basically electrify all our buildings with solar. We want to provide as much energy as we can with solar. You might want to think about, well, is it better for us to break up in this project over different years and use different contractors so they're different projects, so you don't have to aggregate them together and you don't have to do the prevailing wage stuff. It'd be interesting to see how this plays out though too, because there's going to be so much prevailing wage going on, especially with the bigger installations. So if you have for those big utility scale solar projects and the big ones that serve like huge commercial buildings, those are going to have to meet that. They can't break them up because they're not individually smaller than a megawatt. They're much bigger than a megawatt. So there's going to be a lot of labor that's paid a lot of money from that. That may actually take off some pressure. It may add pressure, it may take off pressure. I'm not quite clear on this, in terms of these smaller projects and how much people are paid for those. But the key thing is, I think, is having a strategy of how to break up your projects, and then think about your labor strategy in general. And I understand you're probably getting hit up, but even if it's not required, they're pushing for it, right?
Yeah, because I mean, they're all in the urban areas, but now this is coming out to the rural areas.
Yes.
And now IBW's like sniffing their head around, like, okay, how can we jam you up?
Yeah.
To the dolly to make sure that you're following everything you're supposed to be doing. So
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So,
Yeah, but it's also important to know your rights. So it's kind of a combination of know your rights and then figure out how to negotiate them based on those rights. But if you break up the projects, they can't force it on you, I guess is the idea. The question is whether there's labor available in the other, the ones that don't demand prevailing wages that are available. That's it's important on both sides, I guess. It's important to know that if I break up the project, they can't force it on us, but be aware that you have to deal with them anyways because they're going to try to push for it. It might also be good actually to get your projects going sooner in light of that too, because as these big projects go forward and there's all this labor that's getting paid more, there may be less that's willing to take less too. Oh, we do? Okay, cool.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Atkins, and I'm the Training and Development Coordinator, and we have a virtual question from Sharon Brown. She would like to know, can DOE supply all the grants and deadlines for attendees? Is biomass eligible for tax credits?
Yes. Biomass can be eligible for tax credits, especially if it generates electricity. Tommy, do you want to speak at all to the deadlines and stuff?
So there's, deadlines all over the place. There's certain, like the grid resiliency program, they have a deadline in March. But there's a few great resources that I like to share related to, a lot of this funding is in some certain areas. So there's something called the White House Tribal Playbook, and that's from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so there's a lot of information in there specifically related to which programs are specific to tribes. And then also from the Inflation Reduction Act, on our website, we had a summit this past November, I believe, and we had someone present on all the different areas within the IRA that can benefit tribes. And so we do have a presentation on our website as well. And if folks need help finding to those areas, I can help you with that. But those don't have all the deadlines in there. And so that's an ongoing thing, revolving funds. And a lot of this money is several years long. And so it'll be available for several years. So for example, the grid resiliency grant, that's a several year program. And from what I understand is they've already extended a deadline once to encourage more tribal members to apply. But I hear the question. I think that's a very valuable thing, is to have information on when the deadlines are for all this. And so I'll look into seeing what we can put together for something like that, because I see the value. Thank you.
I guess, any further questions? I guess, sir?
First of all, Cam's name is at the bar, so people want to listen to two lawyers talk.
Especially first thing in the morning.
My question goes back to the first program that you talked about, John, the $4.5 billion program, climate.
Oh, yeah, the climate reduction grant, yeah. Or the carbon reduction grant? Let's see. I think it's probably this, let's see. Wait, no, back, that's, yeah. Over here. Sorry about this. This one? Yeah, great. It looks that way to me from, the statute is pretty skeletal, but when you read it, it talks about money under this coming to people that got this. So I think it's probably that way, although it's interesting because this one actually extends longer in time than this one does. So you might get this one, but not this one. But then I think the idea is that if you get this one, you'd have a plan, and then you could use all these other programs to get stuff done. I think, but we'll see more details as it comes out. Yeah, I think it is. I think I think the idea is that we want people that are really going to take a deep dive into this and not just put solar on some buildings. I think is the idea. Great. If that's it, thank you very much.